So Jane Holder is Professor of Environmental Law at UCL. As a full-time researcher at the Faculty of Laws at UCL, Jane has focused on environmental assessment from the perspective of securing environmental justice. Recently, she's begun to research the integration of environmental law with animal law, and also the implications for legal education, the emergence and development of these areas of law. So today, Professor Holder will be speaking on the working of the Animal Sentience Committee.
Good. Okay, so we are returning to UCL in 1903. William Bayliss, an assistant professor of physiology, gave a lecture to medical students on the process of secretion, during which he included a demonstration on a brown terrier dog, which, according to Bayliss, was anaesthetized. Unknown to Bayliss, in the lecture hall were two female Swedish anti-vivisectionist activists. They were studying at the University of London on an exchange scheme. And they later alleged that the dog was not anaesthetized, that it was conscious and it was struggling, and further that scarring on the dog had been sort of suggested that it had been used in more than one experiment contravening the Cruelty to Animal Act 1876. The picture on the right is actually Stalin, who was Bayliss's colleague, senior colleague, but Bayliss was the person who carried out the particular demonstration, but Stalin was also implicated. The feminist Swedish activists gathered evidence of this and published their findings and the evidence in the form of a 200-page diary, The Shambles of Science. Bayliss was not prosecuted, but when Stephen Coleridge, a notable solicitor at the time, disseminated the diary, he sued for libel. And there followed a lengthy, really well publicised trial that took London by storm. It was very well publicised. It was written up in the newspapers each day. It led to a short story by Mark Twain called The Dog's Tale. It led to a group of anti-vivisectionists making a memorial to the dog in Battersea Park. And in 1907, it was the site of the so-called brown dog riots between groups of medical students at UCL and groups on the other side opposing them was a group of anti-vivisectionists, suffragettes, and trade unionists. A postscript to this is that Paula Owen, whose book on this trial, is campaigning to have the memorial re-erected in Battersea, the previous bronze model having been melted down, thought, because of its controversy in the park. This little story might be well known to some of you. I tell it because of its legal importance. The brown dog affair led to another Royal Commission on vivisection, and it also led to a reform requiring the prior approval of for the use of animals in vivisection. I came across this story when I was digging around in UCL's archives, looking for appropriate material for a course on animal justice. I feel that animals are really absent from universities. We don't know what goes on with animals in our institutions. And sometimes I think their presence in universities is trivialized. I've heard recently of companion dogs being used to sort of absorb stress from students. And I heard about a petting zoo in Freshers' Week, none of which I think is particularly good. So the brown dog case I start with because I think it gives a sort of a strong sense of a sustained and precise inquiry into the suffering and poor treatment of one particular animal. I'm an environmental lawyer of many decades standing, and it was this focus on an individual animal's life and subsequent death, which was really striking to me. As an environmental lawyer, we're used far more to animals being seen as a collective, as species contributing to the state of biodiversity in a particular area, region, or even continent, if we think about the EU. So this case made me wake up and think critically about the place and treatment of animals within environmental law. And it's that particular subject that I want to talk about today. Following on from Penny's talk, however, I start from the position that the Animal Welfare Sentience Act offers us some radical new perspectives, and potentially very radical new perspectives on environmental law. And it also exposes really clearly, I think, some of the limitations of environmental law and its blind spots. And I think in some cases, I'd argue some really dangerous, limited ethical recognition of individual animals. Now, the impact of this conceptual shift is already being worked out in other areas. Family law, criminal law, Penny mentioned the Online Safety Act. And in law, the Animal Sentience Act has already been seen as a sort of a pluralist foundation for animal rights, and also as a really potentially very disruptive element within constitutional law. The main reason for that, I think, is the fact that it potentially, or fundamentally, shifts the status of animals in law, in constitutional norms particularly, from things to legal persons. Now, returning to environmental law, we are all aware that this provides a really important foundational connection with animals. It's important that we control pollution, that we safeguard habitats, that we secure biodiversity, and that, importantly, we mitigate and adapt to climate change. All of those elements of environmental law are key for the survival, the flourishing of animals. Jane Goodall argues, and I think we listen when Jane Goodall talks, Jane Goodall argues that the loss of biodiversity in the UK and elsewhere can best be halted and reversed by focusing upon individual animals and their communities and ensuring their security and flourishing of their lives in particular places. So she emphasises the role of animals in contributing to creating within the environment states of decay, recycling, rejuvenation. And she argues for the valuing of animals, including those not currently deemed to be sentient, such as insects. Having said I'd be very brief, that was a very long introduction. So I move to my questions. I've got three main questions, hopefully over the next 20 minutes or so. I welcome your thoughts as well on these questions. I'm an environmental lawyer, as I've said lots of times. I'm reading my way into animal law, and I'm really receptive to different perspectives on environmental law from the animal law perspective. I'm also being really benefiting hugely from my co-authorship in the paper that this is taken from, Joanna Smallwood at Sussex and Rob Amos at Birkbeck. Both of them are working on animal law. Joanna studying black bears in Ecuador, Rob studying orchid cultures and the impact on environmental law perceptions of animals. So these three questions then, quite simply, I want to think about the legal characterization of animals within environmental law, the impact of the 2022 Act on characterization of animals, and then I want to try and delve a little bit deeper by thinking about rewilding projects and the place of the individual animal within strategies for enhancing biodiversity. And in that context, I want us to engage in a sort of a bit of legislative analysis following Penny's scrutiny of the sort of triaging, gatekeeping of different legislative proposals. I want us to have a think about the Climate and Nature Bill, which is excitingly restarting its passage through Parliament. Okay. I should mention on those points that, and I'll get this up front, my key conclusion is that the constitutional and legal character of animals as subjects of law, rather than objects of law or things, is evolving currently outside the boundaries of environmental law, but that the co-evolution of animal law and environmental law is having a strong impact upon the doctrinal interpretation and practice of environmental law. And I think that there's some prospect of a beneficial congruence and integration of these two subdisciplines of law. Okay, so in terms of thinking about the characterization of animals in environmental law, I flagged the characterization up here as being one of instrumentalism, collectivism, and nativism. And I'm focusing here specifically on nature conservation law. My colleagues in the Fuller paper have also been thinking about animals, or their depiction of animals as sources of pollution, as nature-based solutions and things like that. But here I want to focus particularly on nature conservation because of this concern about biodiversity and rewilding. I've picked out here two key governing pieces of legislation within nature conservation law. The Environment Act 2021, which has really centred within that piece of legislation the importance of biodiversity. The centrality of biodiversity is now really clear. And following this instrumentalist approach, animals are deemed to be constituting biodiversity within UK and other parts of conservation law. I'm thinking particularly of the EU as the most obvious example of that. We have in the Environment Act 2021 a species abundance target. Centrality of animals is seen as key to biodiversity gain, and biodiversity net gain is now a condition of planning permission of large-scale infrastructure projects. And there is also the need on the part of the Secretary of State to produce species conservation strategies. Looking to the Wildlife and Countryside Act, we know that this prohibits killing, injuring or taking any wild animal. So a hugely detailed piece of legislation overlaid by amendment upon amendment, but that's the basic legal core, is that prohibition, coupled with very expansive defences, including the killing, the defence available for the killing or taking taking animals in the interests of public health, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and also nature conservation under the auspices of management, culling invasive species, and so on. There are lengthy schedules which detail the categories of animals which may or may not be killed or taken by trapping. To the extent that it's possible, I think, to conclude that under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, that harm suffered by free-living wild animals is frequently sanctioned and or defended. There's also, within the detail of that act, you'll also find a lot of provisions which provide for such activities as the night killing of rabbits and hares, which many people use as sport. I'm going to move from the sort of framework to thinking about some detail on nature restoration and rewilding, coming back to this theme of animals as biodiversity in environmental law. This is a really prevalent approach, nature restoration. in order to try and halt and actually enhance biodiversity, newer, more natural approach to nature, poetically presented by Monbiot as opening up the ecological imagination. His feral book details his journey into rewilding and his advocating of that. The EU is now placing rewilding at the centre of nature restoration strategies. The 2024 regulation includes rewilding as a sort of key plank of that policy. And in a really expansive, comprehensive article in the Modern Law Review this year, Kirkis goes so far as to say that the regime for protection at the EU level under the Habitats Directive on Flora and Fauna, which I didn't include in the UK's framework for obvious reasons. Now we're in the nature conservation vacuum post-Brexit. But he makes a strong argument that his view is that the nature conservation regime is so strong that some protected animals are no longer things, because the protective regime prevents owners from doing what they like with animals on their land. I disagree heartily, and I'll explain why in a bit, but the presentation is such that he considers that animals in that category are similar in legal status now to that group of companion animals which are subject to custody cases and are considered to be less things and more parts of the irreplaceable, valuable members of the family. So Kirkis draws an interesting similarity between the domestic forum and free living wild animals. I'll explain in a while why I disagree with that presentation of interpretation of conservation law. This is the sort of positive presentation. It sees the sort of popular imagination, and it's very well publicised in books, films, and so on. And it now does form a sort of central plank of nature conservation law, particularly that relating to nature restoration. In terms of animal welfare within rewilding, DEFRA's code and guidance adheres to the idea of welfare protection, and I think Dan, your talk made us very alert to what that means and what that means potentially in practice in this context. And since 1976, there is the need for appropriate levels of welfare protection also on a legislative basis, to the extent that introductions of certain wild animals will require licenses under that provision. However, looking at this more in the round, there is, I think, a concern amongst some conservationists about the opportunities that this affords for entrepreneurism. Some of the advocates of rewilding point to wildlife safaris, increasing property prices in an area, and being able to successfully brand urban areas as rewilded. There are some serious, I think, ethical issues relating to this area as well, when viewed from the perspective of the individual animal. I'm thinking here about the adverse impacts on existing animals, and the potential introduction of viruses and diseases, the failure of translocations, the rise of guerrilla rewilding, which I have to say was the typo which led me to send Ben a new load of slides this morning, because I had put gorilla, which I thought wouldn't really be appropriate, maybe not. So there are some real concerns about when viewed from the perspective of the individual animal, about rewilding, for want of a better word, in some cases experiments. And these are important considerations to take into account. I also question this interpretation of strong levels of protection for wild animals. We're losing habitat at such a rate that, although I've talked separately to Penny about the challenges of trying to make decisions about the balance between so-called native and so-called non-native species, that the loss of habitat is absolutely key to that debate. And if we look at the EU level, which is what Kirkus's work was focusing on, the Habitats Directive was not implemented on time. The Habitats Directive has holes in it. It is not a coherent ecological network as it was designed to operate as. And Article 6 of the Habitats Directive allows for the loss even of priority species and priority habitats, even so long as certain procedural safeguards are carried out, such as an appropriate assessment of the conditions of development, either for management purposes or some other infrastructure development, for example. So I consider that actually, when we think about the place of animals within nature conservation, at least in the UK, even after 30 years of EU protection under the Habitats Directive as implemented within the UK, we're still looking, I think, at animals that are conceived by law and protected by law in an instrumental way as components of biodiverse habitats, not as either and or sentient beings or subjects of a life. So you can, I think, to some extent, from this perspective, work against this ecological ideal of wild spaces when looking at it from the perspective of the individual animal. I want to move on now. I'm not going to look at wild animal suffering and welfare intervention. I'm going to move instead on to thinking about the consequences of my conclusions in terms of compassionate conservation, and the idea that there is a need for the interests and the agencies of all sentient beings to be taken into account and protected in conservation practice. And we are, I think, beginning to see some glimmers of this compassionate conservation approach. The issue about extending beyond sentience is one that Penny picked up clearly, and I was really pleased to hear her thinking about how the committee is looking to future work in this area. And certainly, I think that there is a really strong argument for the potential adoption of an environmental principle, the precautionary principle, when considering the protection of animals which there is uncertain scientific evidence about their sentience or not. We could go through the points on compassionate conservation in a lot of detail, but for the sake of moving the exercise on, I was really struck, I've been struck by the reports that I've read of the Animal Sentience Committee, which are looking either at draft pieces of legislation or legislation which is already in place. And I thought a sort of an interesting exercise in that respect, looking at where is the individual animal within environmental law, could be done by thinking about the Climate and Nature Bill, which is working its way again through Parliament. I don't know if this is something which is familiar to any of you. No? This is good. This is good. I like this. Okay. So the Climate and Nature CAN bill, it used to be the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill when it was drafted by XR many years ago, but that wasn't as snappy an acronym as CAN. So the CAN bill is really a fascinating conception. It recognises that we cannot deal with the climate crisis without also in tandem dealing with biodiversity loss. The two go absolutely hand in hand. Biodiversity loss is going to be exacerbated by climate change. This is all very familiar stuff. What this bill does, which is different, is that it also democratizes by introducing a public assembly. It democratizes strategies and progress and targets concerned with both addressing the climate change crisis and also addressing biodiversity loss. I mentioned that it was originally drawn up by XR a few years ago. It's a very clever strategy. If you are an XR activist now in this country, you are at severe risk of being imprisoned for a very long time. The ability to carry out direct action, which is meaningful and impactful, has now been almost completely shut down by the legal system, to the extent that our judiciary have been visited by the Aarhus Sentencing Commission. It's been seen internationally as a scandal. Anyway, I could go on about that and I won't, but to say that this is a legislative alternative route that XR is taking. It's now been taken on also by 0 Hour, and it's been the subject of 2 private members' bills, one just very recently by Will Savage. And I think it's really interesting to say that it's following the same pattern, the same support base, the same methods that were adopted by campaigning groups with the Climate Change Act of 2008, which was a groundbreaking, it was a global first, the Climate Change Act. So although this is a private member's bill, I think there is something in it which is potentially can be hardened into law. If it's not hardened into law, it's still a very, very impactful piece of legislation. I won't go into this in any great detail. It's a very short, punchy piece of legislation. You can look it up. But the key headlines are that there is a nature target, a climate target, public involvement via an assembly, and that the recommendations of that assembly are to be reviewed by the Committee on Climate Change and the Joint Nature Conservation Committee. It's been deemed to be a potentially very radical piece of legislation, and one which is sort of a manifestation of what organisations like 0 Hour and XR wish to achieve. So its objectives, it wishes to reduce the overall contribution to global greenhouse gases, and also to halt and reverse the degradation and loss of nature in the UK. And this is the really radical extraterritorial element, also overseas. That is very, very potentially impactful. Difficult, but impactful. In terms of the nature target, the aim is to increase the health, abundance, diversity, resilience of species, populations, habitats, and ecosystems. And looking at the duties of the Secretary of State, both the climate and nature strategy objectives, I've highlighted those which relate to animals in some form. E here being ensuring that steps taken under the strategy to mitigate emissions in the UK and overseas minimise damage to ecosystems, food and water availability, and human health as far as possible. I imagine that's referring to such mitigating measures as renewable energy infrastructure. These are the two that really are striking to me from an animal law perspective, rather than with my environmental hat on, and that is that these objectives of restoring and expanding natural ecosystems and enhancing the management of cultivated ecosystems in the UK and overseas are to enhance biodiversity, ecological processes and ecosystem service provision. And that those activities which affect the health, abundance, diversity and resilience of species, populations and ecosystem priorities and the avoidance of the loss of nature through adherence to the hierarchy. Again, in terms of objectives, the emphasis is on ecosystems and human health. Thinking about this from an animal justice perspective, it is radical up to a point. It's very holistic. It's recognizing the linkages between climate change and biodiversity loss, the holistic conception of the problem. Its objectives and its participatory structures are new and potentially, as I say, very impactful. It's ambitious in its extraterritoriality, but for me, the really striking point here is it lacks specific regard to animals. There's no reference to animal welfare, flourishing or capabilities, nor sense of animals as a sentient and or as a subject of a life. We almost, I think, see in this very radical piece of legislation, which I think demonstrates some of the task that the Animal Sentience Committee has got, that we're looking here at an instrumental rather than an intrinsic approach to animals. And this, I've got a few slides here on the constitutional instances of animal interests. That instrumental approach is, I think, very out of sync, out of time with the massive constitutional developments and evolution that is taking place in this field. Going back to Article 13, obviously, of the Treaty on European Union, specifically the German Basic Law advances recently, and we've mentioned several of these cases of grassroots legal activism. The last one of which, the Estrelita monkey case, is, I think, fascinating because it raises some questions about the place of animals within rights of nature approaches. So sorry, I'll go back to that for a minute. In terms of summary, I pretty rapidly, I think, explored some of the difficult issues raised by seeking some legal and ethical symmetry between animal law and environmental law in the UK. Focusing on the individual animal within environmental law stimulates some really critical thinking about the anthropocentric assumptions and priorities of environmental law, even though for decades now, environmental lawyers have critiqued that anthropocentric gaze and sought to move to a more ecocentric approach. The subject matter of animal law is extreme. This is something which I grapple with when teaching animal law to students. We've been exposed already today through the talks to the harshness and violence suffered by animals, that's routinized, that is out of view on an unimaginable scale. We know this and we live with it. I think that focusing on conservation law and also other areas of environmental law makes us own up to some of the responsibility for the harm done to some categories of animals, including free-living wild animals. So I've just got a few conclusions, having summarised. Within this space between animal law and environmental law, I think there is some scope for reconciliation, even though that's a complex and difficult task. I would personally say I think that that's most likely to happen through a multi-species or post-human approach. but being really mindful. And I was very struck in Penny's talk about her returning to the real world environment in which the Animal Sentience Committee is working and in which we live. That isn't going to happen anytime soon. You know, Dan spoke very clearly about the challenges of confronting vested interests and the difficulties of doing that politically. There are huge difficulties in doing that as well. So until there is substantial ethical movement towards that multi-species approach, I think the 2022 Act offers a sort of a legislative installation of hope, and it brings us, I think, closer to what Barbara has talked about, which is both recognising animals as deserving of rights and respect, but also as essential parts of the ecosystem. Just to finish off, my real sense from looking at this material with my co-authors as well is that the work of environmental lawyers has really just begun. We think we've come a long way. There's still an awful lot to do to address some of these difficulties surrounding how we properly treat and protect animals as they move and sense the world. Big thanks to the organisers. Thank you as well.